Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for attending on a Saturday morning, 9 o'clock here in Padova, Italy. I'm Nigel Evans. I'll be discussing and share this session. Session very, very exciting in terms of new horizons in personality assessment, and we have Rainer and Michaela here to really go through some of the very interesting and extensive work they've been doing in personality, but personality linked to things, I guess, in the real world and extended aspects of personality, including success factors, team real assessments, and emotional intelligence. And I know this is really interesting for people practically, but also theoretically, because there are some people who say, should personality stay personality? Should we actually link it to other things? So Michaela and Rainer will be talking and going through some of their, let's say, extensive, detailed and numerical work. So you're in for the, I say, an early, perhaps heavy session as well, heavy on data. And I say what we will do is we'll do one paper and then we'll have questions at each time. So we'll have that sort of structure around. So please gather your questions as you go along, make some notes, and the floor is yours, Rainer and Michaela.
Okay, thank you very much, Nigel, for your kind introduction. We go back a long way, and I remember we had a symposium in Dublin in 2016 or so, where we collaborated. My name is Rainer Kurz. I'm the chief psychologist at Hukama. Hukama is a HR consultancy headquartered in Copenhagen. I'm actually based in London, and our IT team is in Bali, and I hope to get a business trip out there soon. So, in a nutshell, we are an occupational assessment consultancy, and we have spent more than 30 years in the industry. But in our latest venture, we really are breaking out of the occupational assessment space. We have looked very much at the NEO, the gold standard measure of the big 5 personality factors, and we incorporated that into our research design and many other topics. So that the coverage of what we are doing is very much across personality, whether applied in occupational, clinical, educational, or general assessment settings. And we've been guided a bit by the work of Colin de Young and his cybernetic personality theory, and I will make frequent reference to that, comparing and contrasting our take on things. So we are going to talk about the theory first, then Michele will take us through the role wheel assessment, where we tackle the old thorny issue of the normative ipsative debate and what our take on that is. And then finally, we've got a paper prepared together with Bodil Jonasson in Sweden, who is on the call, who was keen for us to develop a measure that covers emotional intelligence. And so we'll show how we went about covering that. So I will get started then with the first paper. The slides will be available certainly from us and probably also from EFPA. I put the abstract of the paper on the first screen to in a way give an overview of what's happening. So this is the whole symposium of the 3 papers. And then what I want to talk about here is de Young's cybernetic personality theory. So cybernetics, you think of Arnold Schwarzenegger and Terminator, but actually it's about goal-directed activity, and it's a very welcome contribution that Colin de Young has made over the last 20 years, but I will be making some suggestions for improvements. So what I'll talk about is a development effort to get to a tool called personality factors with 48 facets, which includes most of the NEO facets. and how that relates to the stability and plasticity meta factors in Colin de Young's model. So what's the background for all of this? I joined SHL, Saville and Holdsworth Limited in the UK in 1990. By that time, the OPQ, the Occupational Personality Questionnaire, had been going for 6 years very strongly, and it had a Pentagon version with 5 factors, octagon with 8 factors with 14, and a concept model with 30. I got involved in the meta-analysis of more than 20 studies linking personality to criterion areas and also ability to criterion areas. Out of that work, we developed a standardized criterion measure. We used that extensively, and that brought up the idea of using 8 rather than 5 factors to account for the validity patterns. I built on that when I joined Saville Consulting, where we developed the WAVE model with 4 clusters that are higher order factors, if you like, of the grade 8. And at Cubics, I came up with a clever term, I thought, of emotional agility. With people being excited about emotional intelligence and learning agility, I thought, let's put those 2 together. Emotional agility sounds good, covers a lot of interesting ground. And then my senior boss told me that someone copyrighted the term already. So Susan David has the term emotional agility booked, and it's about emotional processing in a relatively narrow sense. But that's roughly what I've been working on, and that underpins what we call competency factors. My colleague Michele has been more on the NEO, on the Big 5 side of things. NEO was developed at the same time as OPQ. OPQ beat it in a way with a Big 5 solution. Louis Goldberg worked on the trait descriptive adjectives, 100 adjectives to measure the Big 5. We adopted that for some of our work. He's also the driving force behind the International Personality Item Pool, the IPIP item pool, where you have public domain versions of major tools. And he was also involved in a co-validation study based on the Eugene Springfield study, at the same time as Saville was conducting a co-validation in the more commercial space. And the speciality of Hukama is job fit, competency matching. And so these kind of trajectory elements underpin, if you like, personality factors. So how does Colin de Young fit in here? About 2001 in this time scale, there was the first article that mentioned stability and plasticity. Then there was an article delineating 10 aspects of the Big 5. And then more recently, an article about the cybernetic Big 5 theory. So I'm going to try to string all of these things together. My background is in ability testing, so I've been doing that since 1986 when I started my psychology degree, and I tortured my friends with a reaction time experiment that I programmed on my Commodore C64 computer, audiovisual reaction time. So I've been in computer-based assessment since 1989. Many of the audience will not even have been born then. I then started at SHL in 1990 and learned about ability testing. And as you all know, there's a general factor of intelligence. All cognitive tasks, they tend to correlate. Philippe Vernon came up with the major groupings of verbal educational versus spatial mechanical, and then minor group factors, and then you can divide it further. So that kind of ability hierarchy is well established. My take on it in my PhD was to look at the occupational realm, where usually 6 abilities are covered: verbal, numerical, concentration, spatial diagrammatic mechanical. I call that the dream model, the differential reasoning model, to tie down which content areas should make up a specified general reasoning construct. Because the problem with IQ is that it is what the test measures, and if you have more spatial tests in it, then it shifts to the spatial reasoning. If you have more verbal tests, it shifts to the verbal reasoning. So we cannot rely on factor analysis to give us a general factor. We need a faceted definition. So Goodman facet theory I found quite helpful. So I looked at other things like speed accuracy trade-off and so on. So that's what was my main activity at SHL. And I try to keep out of Peter Savills' way as much as possible. But the question arises, is there a hierarchical structure to personality? And in the 1990s, that would have been a complete no-no. It took the academics until 1990 to come up with the big five. So agreeableness, conscientiousness, and emotional stability are three of them. And they form together the alpha factor of personality, according to Dickman. And then extroversion and openness are correlated, and they form what he called the beta factor. And then the academics in the 1990s were quite happy with the big five. Now that they were found, nothing else was of interest. But then over time, interest emerged in higher order constructs and more detailed constructs. My work involved this kind of meta-analysis that I mentioned briefly, and I'm responsible for getting this table into that article. Basically, we had the problem that all criterion validation studies had different criteria. And so Ivan Robertson and Andrew Kinder, they first had to match the criteria to get a manageable amount of criterion areas. And that's what they came up with. And so, for example, creative is a criterion area that was then mapped to OPQ scales called innovative and conceptual that validated well. And then change-oriented was mapped but didn't validate so well. In big five terms, that's basically about openness. And in NEO terms, that would be openness to actions, openness to ideas. So that's how I annotated this slide for those who are less familiar with OPQ and such measures. Planning and organizing underpins conscientiousness, which in NEO terms primarily order and deliberation, extroversion, agreeableness, low neuroticism. That's how far we got. Post hoc, I can say that basically even at that time, I found that achieving was behaving quite differently to the other conscientiousness constructs, and that in a way was the starting point for developing the grade 8. Also analysis, we had to eventually invoke that construct to account for problem solving. And then we also had need for power to account for managing staff. So that was my starting point for getting to the grade 8. There were some other areas which were perhaps quite ill-defined, and so I wouldn't want to allocate them to anything particular. The work led to a standardized criterion measure called the Inventory of Management Competencies. And here's a snippet of information from an article published in 2000, which compares performance proficiency with promotability or potential. And you can say proficiency is about being expert, organized, and quality-driven. Which of the big five would perhaps underpin that? Perhaps conscientiousness. And for expert, perhaps a bit of braininess. Then for promotability, if we look at line manager ratings, being innovative, decisive, articulate, persuasive, flexible, and most of all, motivated, that makes you promotable. So that's quite a different set of qualities. And the OPQ composite predictor for conscientiousness only related to being organized and quality-driven in a positive way, and then negative to a lot of other criterion areas. Notice that achieving wasn't included in that equation. I'm not responsible for that. I think that was a bit of a mistake. So here again, we can have the ocean mnemonic in action: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and then N Instead of neuroticism, we look at the opposite, low neuroticism. So that accounts for most of the criterion areas, but we needed to invoke need for achievement to understand what's happening for motivated and commercial analysis for 3 other criterion areas, and the need for power for the remaining 2. So that's how the grade 8 started to emerge. This is a busy slide showing studies A to E in the UK, F in Turkey, which involved a trip to Pamukkale, which was quite fun, and one other study in the US. Some of the criterion areas, ability tests make a useful contribution. At the workplace, we don't differentiate too much between personality and ability. We want competence and competency. People are meant to perform their jobs well. So we need to have a model that encompasses the performance space, and we shouldn't get too stuck on personality theory if it's performance that really matters. And in a way, the grade 8 are pretty much one of the leading models of performance. So we can again use the ocean mnemonic to categorize things, and you can see that the analysis criteria, they are the ones where ability tests, the second row, make a very substantial contribution. This all was then cross-validated with the Korean and the Japanese study, and all of that went into this massive correlation matrix. The details are not particularly important. I color-coded the grade 8 and the marker scales that we a few years later came up with, and you get 0.1s, occasionally 0.2s across all of these studies. And I supervised an MSc thesis, and in the IMC total column you get overall performance, and you manage a 0.16 for persuasive. That's perhaps as high as it gets. For the separate proficiency scale, correlations are quite low. Remember that the predictor tool is ipsative. So how far can you go with ipsative measures? On a point-to-point level, you can go quite far. But as the sum is a constant, you can't do much in overall prediction. Promotability, again, persuasiveness is highest, but the observed validities were quite limited. So that was the 1990s, and now many more advanced methods have been developed for quasi-ipsative measurement. But that's where the grade 8 mappings and their validities are shown across quite a large sample. At the time, I still was working with the big 5 equations that they were the official ones at SHL, so they were reasonably well developed, but you can see that organizing and executing conscientiousness has detailed conscientiousness forward planning in it, but not achieving. I don't really understand why, because that misses out on the most valid part of conscientiousness. However, it gave me the opportunity to put achieving in as a separate marker for need for achievement and needs for power. I measured through controlling, and then to represent analysis, we had verbal and numerical reasoning tests. And then when we factor analyze that with criterion data, we get a 8-factor solution, reasonably clean, due to the ipsativity, the enterprising and the performing factor also has negative loadings on supporting and cooperating. That's kind of agreeableness versus disagreeableness. And if you just use a big 5, you are nice or nasty. And at SHL, we developed the images version, which had the big 5 plus achieving as a orthogonal separate scale. So partly due to the ipsativity, these factors were pretty independent with the highest correlation point around 0.35. But that is a bit artificial because of ipsativity. So that's all the kind of prep work, 10 years before I put together the WOW model, the world of work model, to account for person-environment interaction. So we can look at capacity, what's the reasoning requirements, what does a person bring, competency, what are the behavior requirements, what does a person bring, expertise, what's the knowledge and interest of the person, how does it match the requirements? Then outcomes, looking at key performance indicators and values, how does it match the individual motivation and values? We developed, we wrote a book chapter and that is my second most popular download on ResearchGate. And we developed a terminology for describing the competency requirements that derive from the environment and how we can summarize the dispositional characteristics. So for recruitment, we use that kind of information. And on the job, we can compare the actual behaviors and outcomes with the desired behaviors and outcomes. So that's what we call work competency across job, occupation, goal, and role demands. At the time, we looked at competencies as sets of behaviors that are instrumental in the delivery of desired results or outcomes. Now we look at competencies as components of performance that are underpinned by dispositions. So we closely couple personality and competency and leave the rest of the definition intact. So here are the titles of the grade 8 as we came up with them in 2002, and the constructs that underpin those 8 factors. And on the right, you can see the new terminology that we have come up with as part of our development effort. The mappings that I earlier referred to, they were published in a 2005 article by Dave Bartram after I had left SHL. And he did a good job in aggregating in a second meta-analysis a lot of data. And we can see that 4 of the 8 competencies have a substantial ability contribution. But it's really only analyzing and interpreting where ability tests are more valid than the personality composite. In all other areas, personality is more valid on a point-to-point level than ability. And so what we are trying to do is develop prediction systems that at the level of these 8 factors predict from both a personality and an ability angle. And we are building on all of this work rather than claiming to do something completely different and where we are the only ones who do the right thing. So it's a cumulative model. In that sense, it was then helpful to look at the work of the Young, who came up with the terms stability and plasticity to replace the words alpha and beta, which are in a way a bit unhelpful. And he is quite big in clinical psychology, and he relates these personality aspects to serotonergic and dopaminergic functions. So that is quite helpful to have a link to neuropsychology. So,
please,
yeah,
yeah, just so the last slide.
So, yeah. It's a funny kind of article. Are there neuroses of health? And so a very applied clinical topic driving relabeling of alpha beta into stability plasticity. And so I think it's quite helpful that this happened and that Colin de Young took an interest in that area and then in a way took the lead. And so credit to him using good terms there, better than the Digman terms. And that's what we are building on. In the article, especially also in the 2015 article, there is a graph with this, and I nicked the colorful version, I think, from Steve Woods. So we know the big 5, we know alpha, beta, okay, we call it stability, plasticity, and then then the Young created aspects, and the aspects, they split each factor into 2, and so we modeled our approach on that by splitting each of the grade 8 into 2, which gives a nice faceted definition of the constructs. But I will have some serious criticism about the titles and perhaps even the constructs that are shown here in the bottom row. Is there anything missing in this graph? What's missing? The general factor, the bad general factor of personality. So that's a bit of a controversial construct, but Musek from Slovenia in 2008 came up with the general factor of personality, or 2007. I earlier came up with the idea of a general factor of competency, which is perhaps less controversial because at the workplace we know that the best performers are performing well across a range of areas. And so there's a bit of controversy whether the general factor is a response style, an artifact, or whether it's genuine. So we tend to not talk much about it. But I think it exists. And a lot of the validity of personality assessment is tied in with that general factor, whether we like it or not. So that's the hierarchical model of personality, unthinkable when I started my career in 1990. Do the big five correlate with success, with leadership success? Yes, extroversion used to be the main predictor, agreeableness, less so. You're meant to lead rather than say, yes, sir, yes, ma'am. When we look at Timothy Judge revisiting the Ohio leadership studies, we have terms like consideration and initiating structure, which seem to be quite valid. What's it about? It seems to be about people, and it seems to be about tasks. So people versus tasks, that's an easy to understand distinction. So we are building on that in our model. I did a 2x2 already in 2002, and there we had alpha beta, which nowadays we would have as stability plasticity, task and people remains. And we developed, or Dave Bartram and Professor Peter Ward developed a model of 4 leadership functions, and I put the grade 8 underneath, and that is still the most expensive OPQ report, the corporate leadership report. Based on our research over the last 20 years, we would now suggest that analyzing and enterprising should swap position. At Saville, we developed a performance 360 tool that had a behavior, ability, and global kind of component. And so 36 behavioral areas, 6 abilities, and 3 items for global performance. We did some data analysis on that, and of course, you get a general factor of effectiveness. Annotated, you get task versus people and alpha versus beta, broadly speaking. And when you rotate it, you get promoting change, working together and demonstrating capability, like a 3-component model of performance that's quite in line with task and contextual performance by Borman and Moto-Vidlo, but it adds a third one of kind of promoting change, leadership behaviors, if you like. So that was quite exciting. And when we look at that visually, we can see that working together is underpinned by agreeableness and emotional stability, demonstrating capability as conscientiousness and reasoning. And then there's a big promoting change grouping. Wouldn't it be nice if we would split that into 2? Then we have kind of 4 for each of them. So that's what we've done 10 years later. Is this just an ad hoc model? If we look at the meta-analysis of Bartram 2005, we can see that on the criterion side, the 2-factor model emerged, which was like task performance versus contextual performance. And when on the OPQ side, 3 factors emerged, which tallied with exactly these, which were found with Saville Wave. So there seems to be some generality to this rather than an instrument-specific artifact. I like 3 things, like I did a leadership version, contextual leadership and task performance. I compare it to Buddhism. I'm a practicing Buddhist. So where we talk about Buddhist principles of or virtues of compassion, courage, and wisdom. In psychiatry, Dan Siegel talks about relationships, energy, and information as the three main pots that underpin what's happening. If we would ask Dickman, he would probably agree that alpha beta could be joined by gamma. De Young could ask him about stability and plasticity. How about some solidity? And if Hogan and Holland talk about getting along and getting ahead, how about getting it right? And so it's Cubics, I came then up with the engaging, enterprising, excelling three-way split, the same kind of constructs, just different titles. And that looked something like that. We did a kind of circumplex arrangement where creativity and dependability were the opposite poles, a bit inspired by the Holland circumplex, and then adaptability and drive, inner confidence versus outer confidence, so you can compare and contrast. And then supportiveness versus assertiveness, soft and hard kind of leadership. I put that all together in a funny program called Storm, produced by QED in Prague. And this chart shows how constructs sit topographically. So we can recognize alpha stability at the upper half and beta plasticity at the lower half. What's the other bit about? That seems to be people versus task, and you could put some internal kind of stuff in between. Why is it important? When we look at derailment, it's really attributes being in overdrive. And then if you have too much agreeableness, you get dutifulness in Hogan Development Survey terminology, and that tends to be bad news. Too much conscientiousness would be diligence, but the validity pattern actually is quite positive. Openness, too much ideas, too much imagination, you get a bit of a loose cannon effect, especially if conscientiousness is low. So I know about that kind of stuff. Being mischievous, bold, colorful, rather than leading to derailment, it tends to be positively related with performance. And I would worry more about low scores on those scales. And then moving away are 5 neuroticism-oriented constructs, and they are bad news. So we can explain derailment as being just the edges of the big 5, too much of a good thing. The Schwartz model I came across when I was at Cubics, and it has a task kind of axis from openness to change conservation, and a people axis from self-transcendence, being nice, to self-enhancement, looking after number 1. And that inspired the previous model. And I found that PSYOP, that Barrick and Mount fame, matched the Schwartz model to 4 of the big 5. So that is nice to see that convergence. And finally, an ingredient was the model of potential that Silzer and Church developed. So we worked on that, and nearly everything can be accounted for by personality and ability predictors, and perhaps performance. You need a 360 competency measure. And so most aspects of potential can be covered with psychometrics. My final piece at Cubics before COVID hit and redundancies, I put together some match predictors and criterion areas with 4 kind of higher order clusters. But it was again a backward mapping where bridge was primarily agreeableness, grass primarily conscientiousness, each extroversion, and flex based on openness. And then I left Cubics, and I thought, what's happened in academia? So I looked at the young developments, And this is in a way quite interesting that stability, plasticity are good terms. The big five haven't really changed, but there's openness, intellect there. And these aspects, if we look closer at them, assertiveness is already a neo-facet. So orderliness is a neo-facet. Intellect is at least a neo-IP facet. So how can aspects have the same names as facets? That's not so helpful. And then we have openness to experience. I thought that was a factor, and now it is an aspect. That's a bit problematic. When we look at openness to experience, the definition, spatial and temporal correlation of patterns versus imperceptive, not so sure about that. Orderliness, avoidance of entropy, that's an interesting one. Enthusiasm sounds a bit narrow, where we used to use sociability, outgoing, gregariousness and stuff like that. Compassion, I quite like the term. But then volatility, withdrawal, if you do that kind of work, if all the other constructs are on a positive end, where then the scale meaning would be matched, why does the young stay on neuroticism? Why don't we look at being even-tempered and self-assured? So that's what OPQ and many other occupational measures have been doing for a long time. So you get a positive terminology feeding back on how self-assured people are, how even-tempered they are, how optimistic they are, rather than how depressed, anxious, and fearful. Then industriousness, I would have expected achievement striving to be put down here. Prioritization of goals, what else is achievement striving? Bit concerned that drive towards goals is given to assertiveness. Then detection of logical and causal patterns in abstract and semantic information. How about numbers? And then politeness, is that the right thing to measure? Is that not actually conflict avoidance? So we turn that around and make a confrontation factor. So while it's a good idea, it's not super kind of perfect. So we set out to do something bigger, better, building on all of that. And we concentrate on personality and ability as predictors, measures of potential. And we developed a model of competency of performance in parallel from scratch from the grade 8. And so that's what we do, 3 modalities of measurement so that we have tools across the employee life cycle. The personality and competency factors models are parallel. And that is because we looked at half a dozen personality predictor tools that we want to cover, and competency measures, the Hukama model, the grade 8, the WAVE model. And then we emulated transformation and transaction leadership, emotional intelligence, leadership derailment with 4 items per construct. And all of that went into a big pot of 758 items. Half of them were big 5 based neo-IP completed in full. And the final version, as you can see, increased the amount of emotional intelligence coverage, increased the grade 8 coverage. All the leadership ones are transformational rather than transactional, and we didn't use much of the derailment items because they require prior work experience in managerial positions often. So that's what we developed and normed on these poor 466 people who had to sit there for 2 hours doing the questionnaires. And we've got now a newer norm group of more than 1,000 who've done the shorter real version. So the model that we had as a draft, we had the grade 8, and we split each of them into 2, so solving problems and evaluating information. And in that way, kind of, we had an a priori model, and the final model looked pretty similar, a bit of swapping around and refinement. But basically, we have a fresh take on the grade 8 in the light of 20 years of research. That's a busy slide that's for the BPS Psychometric Testing Center review process. They want to know how something was developed, and so that gives a trajectory, what moved from where into its final position. So if you have eidetic memory, you can perhaps analyze it later on or look at the slides. There are a few items in NEO that we didn't want to use, but we used them for research purposes. We don't want to talk about political intentions and religion. We don't want to talk about eating disorders. We don't want to talk about cheating. And we don't want to yell at people or insult people or have a sharp tongue. And we don't want to go toot. And it's not your fault if you know the answers to many questions. So these are some items in NEO IP, which is meant to be the silver standard. But basically, we would want to have something like that in a published questionnaire. So the question is, with that kind of introduction, how do our new scales relate to stability and plasticity? And that's kind of the answer, a big correlational slide. So we added the NEO IP extroversion openness into beta plasticity, and the other three into alpha stability. Of course, neuroticism has to be reversed, and they correlate 0.31, suggesting that there is actually a overlap, and the higher factor, the general factor of personality, or is it the general factor of character? And then when we look at areas such as imagination, emotionality, I'm concerned that they are negatively loading on alpha, and they and that's because of neuroticism, too much fantasy and so on. Not very productive for the workplace, not very good for prediction of creativity. The tricky one here, achievement striving, correlates equally with stability and plasticity. Of course, the achieving striving score goes into the alpha stability, so that gives it a bit of an advantage. So naturally, achieving actually slightly more on the plasticity side, if you would correct for that. Then the self-efficacy has a similar pattern where it strays quite a lot into a kind of extroversion. On the extroversion bit, we get some low values here where disagreeableness starts to be in play. And then modesty doesn't buy you anything, all that. Instead, we turn that into self-esteem. And then finally here, self-consciousness has equal correlation with stability and plasticity. So it's more in the beta realm. So these kind of analysis, we didn't do them directly at the time or intuitively. We picked up on those, but that's what we addressed. This is an even bigger matrix, but I'm not going to dwell on it other than drive being equally correlated with stability and plasticity, and also investigation being equally correlated. So we can make our choice whether it goes into the stability or into the plasticity side of things. Factor analysis, we get a general factor of personality where nearly everything loads apart from empathy and helpfulness and orderliness and rule adherence, competitiveness and trust. The highest loading is for persuasiveness. We get a task force people split, we get a very good big 5 and a reasonable grade 8 when we extract 8 components. So the first and the fourth facets are factor pure, the second and the fifth are a bit more applied, and the third and the sixth facets, they are blends, which Costa McRae would have to reject as academics, but as practitioners or academics, we allow them in our model. And the highest correlation is 0.71 between drive, need for achievement, and influence, need for power. So these motivational scales go together. And the most independent is structure. big correlation matrix if you are inclined to look at that. Some correlations are above 0.55 because the facets are quite close together, but we like to work at that level of detail, and Neo does. And that's basically it, my last slide. We basically have 8 behavioral factors. The Hukama success factors. At the center, we put reasoning. Reasoning interacts with behavioral inclinations. And we have a stability task, a quadrant, stability people, stability plasticity task, and plasticity people. So that's the theoretical model that I developed here. And if you want more practical terms, it's about information, which underpins getting it right, and emotion about getting along, and motivation, getting ahead, and then communication, getting aligned. So that was like my romp through the theory of the grade 8 success factors. And I could talk more about that, but I think I better ask for questions. So thanks for your attention.
Yes, I have a question.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
please.
please do, please.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It's very interesting. You don't talk about the Cloninger model, the model of Cloninger. You don't know? So we have to talk together in the end of the evening.
Okay.
Because there is a lot of common points with your results and conclusion and this model.
Yeah, so the question I would have expected things would have been about the Hexaco model, and their honesty, humility I see as doubling up on agreeableness and having a poor validity record when you look at both ratings, and instead we measure the opposite end, drive and influence and analysis.
Can we have the slides?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I think we are practicing open science and we are encouraging all people to give the slide decks out, whether that be directly or through the site. But definitely anybody who asks should be able to do it. Thank you.
So just to be, when do we have to stop?
The whole thing should stop 20 past at the latest. Yeah.
Okay. So after this interesting run through 30 years of science, or almost 40, I had a couple of things. I'm talking about 2 things. First of all, how do we do group interventions in a smart way, because we want to make a difference. My background is that apart from studying, I became a football coach in my early years and spent a lot of time in a human lab, and wanted to find interesting ways of interacting with people. What we did on request actually from a customer was to see how can we look at a role wheel assessment tool where we group people according to the preferences, but without having a lot of acquiescence. So some people look very smart when they answer these, and others are a bit more sort of depressed in picking the answers, and that doesn't look good when you compare groups. So we were looking at the exercise questionnaire where we could sort of get away with acquiescence, and the entire exercise of trying to figure out how can we get away with response style or looking good or faking good. There's been a lot of different approaches to that. The normative is maybe the best one from statistical purposes, but very open to faking. OPQ and others did an iterative format with its forced choice. So it's yeah, it's a balanced model. You can't get everybody high, you just need to choose. And that has poor psychometric qualities. Sangalo made a quasi-iterative mixed format. Brown did a Estonian idea of calculating normative iterative into normative. And what we found was the right thing was to take the normative, which has the best qualities for factor analysis, and turn that into iterative. So we built on Bartram's ideas from the 90s, and Ryan actually came up with a pretty smart virtual octet where we could single out acquiescence from the scoring and get a very, very neat result. I must say, I was super surprised by the efficiency of that. And just for your reference, a bit of grade 8 mapping where you look at the different normative iterative scales that have been used to map that. We won't have time to go through that. We looked at the Belbin and thought, okay, this is the most widely used model for different roles in a team, and what's effective, what is the strength of different persons, where will they what's their bearing. We looked at the one Reinhard talked about before from Wave, and we put it into our role model here. So what do we need to do in an organization, in a team, is that we need to get things right and get ahead. There always needs to be a balance, because if you want to get ahead before you get it right, it won't work. If you want to get it right and not get ahead, it won't work either. And the same with the people aspect, saying, you need to get along before you can get aligned. But if you're not aligned, you won't get along. So a lot of these things within a team environment are super interesting, and they're interlinked. The task sometimes ruins it from the people aspect. How can you, if you're a football coach and you make the wrong tactical solution for the team, you have problems also on the people side. So all of these things are paradoxes and interlinked. And what we wanted to do was actually compete in the market of very small, slim assessments with the large ones, Hogan and the like, OPQ. And what we did with the same sort of taxonomy was to say we built a core model with two competencies and two facets that are aligned and built together. We go to the professional, so we add to the complexity of the thing, and we go to the executive level and we add even more, telling the sophistication of the role as you go up. But for the wheel or for the roles, we stayed on the 80 because that will allow us to work with only 80 questions to do group intervention bit. Analyst came from learning orientation and technology focus. Implementer from orderliness and meticulousness. Empathy, helpfulness became a supporter. Optimism, patience, the optimist. Determination, goal focus, the achiever. Originality, complexity, orientation, the pioneer. Friendliness, sociability, the networker. And assertiveness, directness, the influencer. And so we turned the grade 8 and kept the same science behind and simply gave it names, and then it works quite fine. A little bit of from Belbin over Wave to us, so pretty much stay in the same vocabulary. We use a 9-point rating scale from a trait adjective, and 9-point scale is an advantage because on a normal 5-point scale, everybody goes from 1 to 3 or from 3 to 5, and leaves us very little space to sort of single out or get better predictors. We use a tiebreaker, so it's an ipsitum component, where you, especially the people with high acquiescence or with how high self-beliefs, they are asked to rate their top or bottom answers once again. So out of 3 9s, which one is the most important? We don't use that for psychometric measures. We use that as a component to show in the test that out of the most important things, this is the very much most important, and that has a psychological interest and an interpretation interest. So that's how we go about it. So you see on this slide here, this was none of those have 3 pluses, but 3 pluses would mean that was chosen first out of the most, and 3 minuses most, first out of the least. And we use that as an item information for interpretation. You can, in our system, simply click all the way to the level of item information. We have a range, so instead of saying inconsistency, we look at the range because all of our items have a norm or normed. And that's interesting. So this is a short range. So instead of saying people are inconsistent, we would much rather like a dynamic interpretation of what actually goes on, and talk to people about it. We have a talent gap, which is the self-efficacy item, the 5th item. If there's a big gap between what I do and what I like, we mark that also. The last one, and the interesting part from now, is if we take away the response style, how does the STEM score land then? On this particular here, we have the interpersonal score go 2 below the normative STEM. So, what is the factor structure of the PF 16 that we used to build the team model? Reliability, convergence, and observability. And then again, looking at the normative ipsative split now from what we do. So you see, similar to what Rainer showed before, just only with 16 facets. We have a general factor of personality, we have task people, big 5 lands neatly, and the grade 8 also in this. The truth is that if you ask for 8, you get 8. If you ask for 5, you get 5. But that's how it is. So how does the ipsative or the interpersonal correlations score with when we compare with the normative correlations? And you see the cross diagonal is very fine. It's about 0.8. So really we're talking about the same thing. Of course, the correlations in the interpersonal, where we have a limited points to give out, is negative, and it's positive in the normative correlation. What about reliabilities? The ipsative, some points lower than the normative, and that's not a lot actually. So what do we see here? I just remove this because I can't see. If we do normative to normative observed criteria validity, we get 0.55. If we do the ipsative to the ipsative, we get 0.44. But if we mix them, we go lower. So a lot of the tools that mix normative and ipsative are not doing good stuff for validity. And that would be our recommendation. If you do normative, do normative. If you do an ipsative, stay there. Don't mix the two. Again, here you see ipsative versus normative, 0.26. So just to get to it, we have a case study that Rainer can take us through. It's your case, Rainer.
So, quick illustrative case study with 5 team members at Ampuria, a small training consultancy founded by Christopher and James 10 years ago. And then they recently put together a more formal company. They hired their virtual assistant Andrea, and then an administrator joined, and recently a consultant joined, and they want to grow the business, and that was the background of the intervention. So we asked them to complete personality factors, and on the group report across those 5 individuals, you can see that interaction is the highest score. So that's then 8 on average across those 5 people, so quite a friendly bunch. And then fairly high on resilience and drive. The detail at facet level, we can see that trust is high and team orientation. And one upshot of the team intervention was, we like our culture, we like our atmosphere, and we need to take care that we only recruit like-minded people, because the main competitor in the market is quite tough and aggressive, and they see that as a point of differentiation. Looking at the individual as the most extreme response style, I picked Beth because she had the highest acquiescence score. So still 9 on acquiescence, so described herself most positively with high scores on interaction, support, and resilience. The lowest score on influence, then 4. So keep that in mind, between 8 and 4, the normative scores. Because of the high acquiescence, we get a lot of interpersonal splits on the second facet. It's always 2 or 3 kind of scores lower. You don't get any splits on the first facet, because on assertiveness, she put herself down, being new to the team. She's a bit quiet and perhaps shy. And so, because there's interdependence between the 8 facets in the same position, no interpersonal splits arrive at the first of the 2 facets. And we then look at the role wheel report for this individual Beth. The highest score remains a STEN 8 on networker, then and also an optimist. Then on supporter it goes down by 1 STEN, and then it goes down by a few more STENs for the other constructs, and for influencer it goes down from 4 to 1. So it's a bit more of a caricature-like arrangement. And no one can have a big wheel because they are full of themselves, or they can not end up with a small wheel because they are shy. So everyone has quite a comparable kind of sum of scores, if you like. Then what we do in the individual report, we highlight the top 3 out of 8 areas and the bottom 2. And that's our take on derailment. We say they are not derailment traits as such. They are just facets of the big 5. And derailment risk is when a high score is out of balance with a low score. And then we give some text that, of course, works best at the individual level, but also can be meaningful at the group level, because several people will be like that. And then penultimate slide for this is a group slide where you can see Andrea, Beth, Christopher, James, and Lucy from left to right with their scores on analyst, for example, where Christopher is the highest scoring person. He's the tech guy who has invented the method and does the video recording of all the training and so on. And if you track through Christopher, you can see that on implementer and achiever, he is a low scorer, so full of ideas, starting a lot of things, but really struggling to get them all finished. And that's where it's helpful to have more structured people like James and Andrea, keeping an eye on things, that things get actually finished. But you can see on network, the min-max is very narrow range. They are all nice and friendly people, and also quite high on optimism. So nice bunch of people to work with. Finally, we do a grid where we look at the frequencies. We expect 40% of the group to fall into the STEM 5-6 part of the normal distribution. And so we can see at a glance where the differences are to the comparison group. So that's all I want to share on this topic.
And an important thing here is that normally you get the average of a group, but it doesn't account for what you could call social capital in the group. You know, who could actually do what. And at the points where the group is lowest, like an implementer, there would be some people who could actually pull. And it's interesting to see that if you think you're good at all 8, normally it's the top 3 that really gets you going. And I know this from sports that you can take many roles, but after an hour, when you get fatigued, you sort of stick to your guns. And that's also what we see in different team dynamic environments. And we had a team session yesterday with the psychometric forum, and one of the points was you can't make group reporting too simple. If you make it too simple, the bad consultants, they grow, but the good ones, they actually fall in quality. Because you need the complexity, you need to know exactly what they're doing. You need to know the environment and the gravity of the group to be smart here and to make a difference. So the last thing, and we are almost out of time, I just
maybe I tell you what, one moment.
Yeah.
Is there any questions from that last one on Teams that anybody's burning to ask? Okay, that's good. So yeah, so really appreciate Michaela to be focused.
5 minutes, okay. So the thing is, actually before me and Rainer joined, we've known each other for a long time. I began to see a pattern in different type of research that the general factor of personality, which I find interesting format, and emotional intelligence correlated extremely high. And the the general factor of personality is basically low neuroticism, high extroversion, high openness, high agreeableness, and high conscientiousness. So easygoing, nice to work with, outgoing, get your things done. And it's an easy life in a way, and they make more money than the rest of us. So at the end of the day, that's a pretty smart concept, and it correlates 0.88 or 0.87 with emotional intelligence on most scales. So what is emotional intelligence if we want to have a construct when it correlates this high? So that was sort of the thing of saying, okay, it's a subset. The same with derailment, as Rainer showed before, is basically the extreme scores of the big 5. And most of them are good. I know from derailment theory that when I tested on professional football players, it was the one with most derailers that had the best careers. The absolute maximum derailers was the captain of the Swedish national team. So that concept is a bit, in my perspective, dodgy. The same goes for emotional intelligence, that you could actually predict emotional intelligence with the scales that we already have. And that was what we set out to do. And very nice article by Van der Linden. I think there's a very, very high overlap between emotional intelligence and the general factor of personality. A concept that's a bit on the way out, learning agility. We also integrated this, Rainer, will in 2 minutes show what we did, how to do that. This is our study. I go through that fast. We did a theoretical mapping of emotional intelligence to big 5, and take out all the literature that I could find about correlations with big 5. And we did an a priori model. We did a couple of other things also to sort of do our pre-study to what we've done, mapping the new IPIP to emotional intelligence with the 4 constructs that we constructed ourselves to sort of get an idea of what we were talking about. This is what you see here. Higher order, the EI total and the personality factors total correlates 0.8. So with total, we mean if you aggregate all raw scores, the higher you score, the higher the correlation with emotional intelligence. And so that's a bit of a revealing slide, I would say. That if you score high IQ, EQ scores, it's simply because you pick more, you have higher aggression. It's an aggression score, basically. And maybe it's a social desirability scale, or it's a social, I don't know, social ease scale. You know, you get along with people easier, you're easier to work with. It's a social desirable traits because they work. What do I know? And but the correlation is high. So my simple question is, why have 2 tools? If we could actually single out emotional intelligence and derailleur scales from the same set of questions and look at curve linear relationships, or that mean overdoing it, or yeah. So that's basically what we did. Without going too much into detail, we came up with this aspects order, and this is so complicated that I leave it to Rainer.
Fall over. So the modeling of emotional intelligence, we started at the outset 3 years ago, and how can we cover these 5 compounds? In the end, we came up with equivalent measures with 4 instead of 3 facets, and we called them reflecting, expressing, caring, navigating, regulating. But then we saw that in many models of emotional intelligence, there's an achieving component, so we added accomplishing. And by doing so, we had 6 times 4, 24 facets accounted for. Good, that covers social and emotional competencies or intelligence, or what do we do with the rest? And that's where that learning agility construct comes in, that it's not just about the people, it's also about tasks, about operations. And so we grouped the remaining 24 into a parallel structure that we call enterprising, directing, inspiring, thinking, innovating, and delivering. And we group it into attitude, process, outcome, groupings of convenience. And then we did a study with 101 people, and we found good correspondence at very good correspondence at the compound level, and also good correspondence at the facet level, that we can cover the same ground. We can do a big 5 analysis. We find that emotional intelligence is mainly about emotional stability, and also a bit about extroversion, openness, not that much about conscientiousness. And we can parallel that structure both on the social emotional aspects, but also on change and result aspects. And that is basically borne out by the data when we factor analyze the 2 tools together. And we come up with a good convergence for the 5 existing compounds, and we add accomplishing, which seems to be a lot covered through the self-actualization scale in the EQI, but we basically get a more granular view. And for the other ones, we have matched kind of themes that are quite handy for feedback to talk about. Then we can basically aggregate them up into agilities. So we get good convergence, and we add accomplishing to the 5, and then we have the whole change in results aspect. So we basically cover through the aspects when we cover same personality facets, but through emotional intelligence and learning agility lens. And we can do that both on the predictor and the criterion side. So the report then basically puts all of that into action. And for example, for James Gold, we have someone with low empathy but lots of energy. So a bit of a loose cannon kind of person. And in the report, we basically do two profiles, one that's social emotional competencies, if you like, and the other one's change in results. And then we can compare and contrast these under the topic of 6 work agilities. So instead of 4 learning agilities, we have 6 work agilities. And there we go, we cover everything in a different, fairly interesting way as an alternative to the strictly hierarchical personality kind of model. I don't know what it says here, but it only says go home, stop. Thank you for your attention.
And I think you also have a question
Yeah.
from the online.
That's a good one.
Yeah, so there's a question about if we know so much about personality and leadership, why don't we apply this understanding to potential political leaders? And it's a good question and an honest and sincere question. But life is even more complicated than what we have covered this morning. So the line between success and derailment is very fine, and you usually see the line only after things have gone wrong. And that's with any scandal, it's the most lauded people who are the leaders, and then you find out that they've done something bad. And it's only really in the light of the day when things have happened that you realize that someone derailed. When they are on the ascent, you can't really tell. It's so close together.
But I think for political leadership now, you can actually see it while it goes on. That's the scary part.
Yeah,
so if you look at the American situation, you know, it's actually why are these people looked upon as strong leaders? That's a really interesting aspect, but we don't have the answer for that. Yeah.
I could jump in between you to say, guys, thank you very much for a wonderful, sort of almost like not quite whistle stop tour. It was a very extensive tour behind, you know, not only your work, but backing up what your work's done through the 10, 15, 20 years that on that. And to, as well, I guess, what I like is the way that you've sort of said that this is not just you, this is not just our thing. You've actually built upon the, you know, the work of others, as well as the work that you've done previously from both, very interestingly, 2 different backgrounds.